Autumn for Black Tree, written and read by Oliver Tonic. This is a completed novella, read as a series. Enjoy the story from here on, or start from the beginning with the first episode. And now, back to the tale. Episode 8, Commodity of a Broken Dream. Barley turned from her and reached into his bag. He pulled out his blanket along with his change of clothes. He held it out before him and walked toward her, blocking his view of her. She took the clothes from him, and he kept the blanket up while she dressed. She finished with her back turned to him. He gripped and held up the very loose-fitting pants while being covered by a shirt so large it swallowed her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Barley looked at the back of her hair falling to her shoulders and walked toward her slowly. He wrapped the blanket around her and turned her around, his hands gently rubbing her arms to stave off a bit of the cold. Her eyes were filled with tears. "Now you know what I am," she wept. "I couldn't tell you. Not after how I found you, after all you'd been through." She shook her head, her eyes cast down. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. Barley could see her tears falling to the dirt. "They were right to try to warn you," she said. "As bad as this place is, it's nothing compared to me." She sniffed and brushed her hair out of her face, rolling strands of it behind her ear. "I'm the monster that lives here. It's always been me." The woods were silent as tears continued to dampen the dirt and dead pine needles at her feet. She couldn't bear to see his reaction. He was wordless as she watched his feet. She felt Barley's finger under her chin as he raised her eyes to meet his. "I see no monster here," he said. She looked into his warm brown eyes and couldn't see an ounce of doubt in them. She could feel his breath as he drew closer. They both closed their eyes as his lips met hers ever so tenderly. In the cool night air, her tears chilled as they rolled down her face. Barley took Paxiss home wrapped in his blanket. His oversized clothes were still giving her trouble, and it wasn't the best in the night air. He opened her door and laid her down on her bed. He lit a fire in her small fireplace with some flint and some kindling that grew on him during the day. He set up a little black kettle to boil on it and found some tea leaves and little ceramic cups in their cabinets. Once the water was ready, he made tea for them both and set her cup on the ground next to her bed. He sat on a little wooden chair as the warm light filled the tiny cottage. He sat next to her small table covered in various supplies she had been using, coming in and out of the house throughout the day. A small, dried, half-eaten leftover piece of bread was on a metal plate in the center. It was clear she got a bite in where she could between work. Barley rotated the plate slowly with his index finger as Paxiss laid on her bed, huddled up with her eyes wide open. A single tear rolled from one eye to the bridge of her nose and then traveled down the cheek on the other side to meet her mattress. There was silence for a while, but Barley was the one to break it. "Well, tell me a story, crying girl," he said with a sad and soft smile. "It seems you have one to tell." Paxiss sat up and wiped the tears from her face. Still draped in the blanket around her shoulders, she picked up her tea from the floor. She brought it to her lips and sipped. The warm steam rolled up her face. She brought the cup to her lap and let it warm her hands. She sniffed and spoke with a voice still nasally. "Well, I should probably start by saying I'm the Queen's daughter." Barley's hand dropped next to his cup and smacked the table with a thud. "No way!" Paxiss laughed as she rubbed her nose with her forearm. "Yeah, I know. It's weird. I hardly believe it myself sometimes." "But you're a servant," he said. Then, as if to immediately contradict himself, he cried, "But you're a princess!" Paxiss smiled. "You make it sound so glamorous." "Well, it's not when you're also a servant." He paused. "But wait, you said just the Queen. Farron isn't your father?" "No." She took a deep breath. "Okay. Once upon a time, there was a girl in Black Tree who... No. Skip my whole bedtime story thing. Just start from the top," he said. She giggled a bit. The moisture that had been keeping her eyelashes clinging together was slowly disappearing. "Okay," she said, again with a deep breath. "My mother had a lot of kids. So did my real father. I'm not the youngest, but I'm close. Most of my siblings don't live in the kingdom anymore. My mother had several kings before Farron. She had many children with them, too. I guess you could say my story started when she was fed up with one of her former partners, King Octo. I don't know exactly what he had been doing to displease her. I've heard a lot of different stories. But regardless of what happened, he no longer was making her happy. He had amounted power and stature in the land after their many years together. This was a problem for her plan to get rid of him, so she concocted an idea to reach out to a nation not far off. She knew the king there was a mighty man. The land he ruled was called Onan, and it was a large kingdom with a lot of wealth due to his plunder of cities. The king's name was Maka, and he had made much of his riches by taking sides in the conflicts of other nations. He had a large army ready to amass a defense against any warring nation for a price, and he was a master strategist to boot. Maka of Onan was perfect for what my mother had in mind. She requested his services and led a war against her own nation. A schism was created amongst the royal guard, the soldiers, and the people, some on the side of Caporia and some for Octo. But with his forces split in half and the powers of King Maka and his men on her side, she took back most of Blacktree. Though both sides were damaged, Octo left battered and broken with what little he had left. My mother was deeply taken with Maka's riches and power. So, after the victory was ensured, she sought to create a marital union with their nations. The king was taken by her looks, but was off-put by her ways. He had no intention of follow-through with a union, and he made that clear. Keenly aware of this, Caporia got as close to him as she could, and became pregnant with me. I was born as a presentation to King Maka, as a bright and new Blacktree and Onan united kingdom. My father was appalled by her actions. Yet, he still cared for me, in his own way. He had several children and thus many heirs already before I came along. My position with him was not unlike my position with my mother. My dad is in love with his way of life. He always has been. Children never change that. And so, I was left in Blacktree, as a princess of a kingdom that never was. And it's clear my mother never forgot that. Barley had been listening carefully. When she stopped talking, it was clear he wanted her to continue. Did he ever come back for you? Pax's face twisted in an exaggerated squint of her left eye. That's kind of a long story. I guess the short answer is no. Barley frowned. Well, what about your siblings? Do you know where they are? At least the ones on the queen's side? Sure, she said. They are all over. Most all of them don't live in the village anymore, but you met the one that does. It's Toka. Toka the farmer? Barley was in total disbelief. Yeah, my mother doesn't raise her children in the conventional way. I'd say she doesn't. Paxis cleared her throat. He's the youngest, and I'm just above him. We've been through everything together. He's often been my only friend through a lot. The corner of Barley's mouth lifted. I'm really glad you had someone. Yeah, she said, looking into her tea. He's King Farron's only son, and definitely my closest sibling. That guy's off, Barley interjected. He couldn't help himself. I'm sorry, but every conversation I've had with him is... No, you're right. You're absolutely right, said Paxis. He's not the easiest person to get along with. What's his story, anyway? Paxis squinted both of her eyes now, as if to see the past as she knew it. My mother was in need of a new man after Octo and Maka didn't work out. She found Farron not long after. He's been my father figure for essentially as long as I can remember. They had Toka when I was only a few years old. Said Barley. I'm sorry, continue. Oh, Paxis raised an eyebrow as she reflected. Right, so my other siblings are leaders of break-off or friendly nations of Blacktree. The girls married off in other kingdoms, and my brothers are at varying levels of success, trying to establish a land of their own. They're among the dignitaries coming to the ball that's coming up. But you and Toka, Barley said, you don't live like the royalty they became. No, that's not the queen's way. And how's that? Paxis sighed. So my mother teaches all of us to be farmers. It's the tradition. She doesn't just teach us, though. She has us work the field and live in it. As soon as it's possible, we're moved out of the palace and into our own home on our own plot of land, and we cultivate it just like the people do. And once we've done our time, or she feels we've mastered the right way to farm, She gives us her blessing and sends us off with the royal benefaction. What is the royal benefaction? He asked. Paxiss shrugged. It's strange and complicated, and honestly, I don't know what it is exactly. I just know I'm not getting it, and that's fine with me. Barley gave another half smile. Why is that? Well, as you can see, I'm no farmer, she said, gesturing to her home, so there's slim chance of me mastering it at any time soon. Plus, her definition of mastering isn't really my cup of tea. What does it involve? Her forehead furrowed. Well, that leads me into the whole fire monster and crops thing, which you haven't asked me about even once, by the way. Barley took a sip of his tea and swallowed, then gave her a sly smile. I had figured we'd get there eventually. Paxiss grinned. You really aren't disturbed by all this? Barley's eyelids lowered. I've seen a lot of things. Paxiss took a sip of her tea. None of the kids really like it at first. Of course, no one wants to get kicked out of their own home. Becoming a landowner as a preteen isn't a lot of fun either, even if a lot of the things are being taken care of for you. She usually lends us farmhands for help for the more back-breaking parts that you can't do when you're small, but you're definitely incentivized. Eventually, she cuts off all food from the palace, and all your food has to come from the crop or the market where you sell it. But it's learning to cultivate the pelodious mushrooms. Barley clapped his hands together. There's the mushrooms. Paxiss laughed. Exactly. Those awful, accursed things. All of the kids fight them. They are deadly and pointless. Yet my mother insists that they are planted. And honestly, we never really plant them. There's no seeds sown. They just kind of appear, and we're required to manage them. But they are a nightmare to cultivate. It's as though we were forced to hatch chicken eggs, raise the chicks, breed them as adults for more eggs, and then she just makes us throw a fox into the coop. What do they like to grow? Barley asked. We start off with the food crops first, things like cabbage and tomatoes, and then we're quickly introduced to incorporating pelodious. They slowly start to pop up in your other crop and eat everything else you grow. You can't keep them within a perimeter no matter how hard you try. Animals, both wild and on the farm, get into them and die, so you have to collect the bodies and bury them under the crop so they don't stink. But you definitely need to bury the animals that they attract and kill, because after you do, the crop flourishes. Just like the cemetery, he said softly. Paxiss nodded and took another sip. He could tell that detail bothered her. He decided to move on. So when does she consider you a master? She looked straight at him and locked eyes. He was giving her his full attention before, but now her face demanded it. When she's sure you would starve for them, she said. What? Barley folded his arms. You can't be serious. As far as I could tell. She put her arms up in a half shrug. There's no goal she tells you to shoot for. But looking back, I watched all my brothers and sisters let their farm get overwhelmed as they got skinnier and skinnier. Barley shook his head in disbelief. How do any of them stand for that? How can anyone in the land stand for that? I've been all over, and I've seen the subjects doing the same thing. Why don't they revolt? They complain that they're starving, but they blame it all on... His eyes opened wide as he answered his own question. The monster. Paxiss closed her eyes and nodded her head in silent affirmation. When I was a little girl, I would sometimes visit my father, King Maka, in Onan. He found me to be strong-willed in my opinions like he was. Although I was small, we still managed to get into heated arguments. Once I got him so angry that he was yelling at me. As he did, I saw fire start to sprout from his elbows to the back of his arms and up his back. His eyes changed too. I knew my dad was known to be a great warrior, and I knew he held some secrets. I knew this must be one of them. But instead of being afraid, I just got so mad back at him that I screamed. When I did, my father fell silent and immediately extinguished. He was staring at me like he never had before. That was the first time I remember turning. Or maybe it's just the first time things made sense. I don't know where it comes from. I've just always been this way. It comes with anger or fear. I can't really control it. Wow. Barley stood up. Their tea was growing cold, so Barley headed back to the fire to stoke it and set up the kettle again. He was quietly pondering as he did. Paxiss just watched him. So you were given a farm, and then he stopped stoking. He was listening. Something was outside. Paxiss heard it too. Someone was approaching, not far off. Her eyes widened. You can't be here, she whispered. They set you up. They can't know you found out. She was right. Clearly, Farron and Kaporia had expected him to find out Paxiss was the monster. If they knew that he knew, then it would complicate his stay here. It could hinder or even halt his progress in figuring out what was really going on. Paxiss! Came a voice from outside. It was a woman's voice that Barley hadn't heard before. Barley went to press his back against the wall to the side of the door. Paxiss kept the blanket on and stood up. Yeah? She called out. What are you doing up? It's late. You have to work in the morning, called back the voice. Paxiss went to the door and cracked it open. Barley stood next to her, away from view, breathing silently. She saw a stern face through the crack in the door. It was the head servant to the king and queen. I'm sorry, Connette. I couldn't sleep. I was having some tea. Well, get to bed, girl. We have prep to do before the ball. I will. I'll tuck myself in soon. Connette gave her a skeptical look before she turned and left. Paxiss closed the door and heaved a sigh of relief. They probably sent her to check on me. You've got to go. I'll go head out when I'm sure she's gone, said Barley. The window in the home was too small to climb out of. Barley sat listening carefully for footsteps outside while Paxiss went to the fireplace and put out the small fire with what was left in the kettle. When Barley couldn't hear anything, he quietly went for the door and cracked it. He turned back to Paxiss in the dark. Meet me tomorrow morning where you pick the tip-top berries. She could see the silhouette of his cheek curve up in a smile. Before he slipped out into the night, he whispered, I think I know how to pay back my debt to you, Paxiss of Black Tree and Onan. Hey guys, it's Oliver. Thank you so much for listening. Give me a like if you enjoyed and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll have weekly episodes up until all 18 parts of the story are fully released, so stay tuned.